My name is Corrine Bishop. I'm 36 years old. I've spent the last 11 years working as a digital literacy instructor at our county library system, which means I spend most of my professional life teaching people. Mostly older adults, mostly people who feel a little lost in a world that keeps updating itself without asking permission. One very simple, very important habit. If something matters, you save it. You don't trust that it'll still be there tomorrow, exactly the way it looked today. That habit is the only reason I could prove, in front of 31 relatives at my parents' 40th anniversary party, that I had never said the things my sister told our entire family I'd said. 6 months earlier, I'd been removed from the Bishop family group chat, the one my mother started years ago, the one that had, over time, become the actual nervous system of our extended family, where every appointment, every photo, every small daily update got shared and absorbed. I found out I'd been removed the way you find out about most quiet exclusions in a modern family, not through an announcement, but through absence. I stopped getting the notifications. I stopped being tagged in the photos. And when I asked my mother about it, gently, over the phone, she said, in a voice that already sounded like she'd rehearsed the sentence, "I think it's better this way for now, honey. After everything you said, I hadn't said anything." That was the part nobody in my family seemed to want to sit with, because the version they'd all absorbed. The version my sister Bridget had carefully, patiently constructed over the course of several private conversations was so much easier to believe than the alternative, which was that Bridget had simply lied, effectively, and gotten away with it for half a year. What none of them knew, sitting around that anniversary party 6 months later, eating cake off paper plates under a banner that said 40 Weirs Toaster, was that I still had it all. Every message, every screenshot, saved, backed up, time-stamped, in triplicate, the way I've trained hundreds of people to save the things that matter to them, because I'd learned that lesson myself, the hard way, a long time before any of this happened. If you've ever been quietly written out of your own family's story while you weren't in the room to correct the record, stay with me to the end, because this one has a moment in it you are absolutely not going to see coming. Subscribe and drop the word screenshot in the comments right now, before we even begin. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly how many of you have lived some version of this. Let's go back to the beginning, though, because you need the whole shape of this family and this chat and my relationship with my sister to understand exactly how something this specific and this quiet could do this much damage. I want to start, actually, a little further back than the chat itself, with my own grandmother, my mother's mother, because I think she's the actual origin point of the habit that eventually saved me. My grandmother, Vera, kept a physical scrapbook her entire adult life. Not a sentimental keepsake exactly, though it was certainly that too, but something closer to a working record, meticulously dated, of every important family event, every letter received, every photograph worth keeping. She used to tell me, when I was small, sitting beside her at her kitchen table while she carefully glued a ticket stub or a newspaper clipping into place, that memory was a beautiful, unreliable thing, and that a family that didn't keep its own record, honestly, would eventually end up believing whatever version of its own story happened to be told the loudest, or the most often, rather than the one. That was actually true. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was much older. I think I understand it completely now. I chose my career, in a roundabout way, because of her. I studied library science initially with a vague interest in archives and preservation, and I drifted, over time, into digital literacy instruction because I realized the exact same principle Vera had taught me with a scrapbook and a glue stick applied, urgently, to an entirely new landscape. One where information could vanish, or be altered, or simply become inaccessible, far more easily and far more invisibly than a physical scrapbook ever could. I've spent 11 years, professionally, trying to teach people the same lesson my grandmother taught me at her kitchen table. If it matters, keep the actual record, because someday, memory alone might not be enough to protect it. My parents, Diane and Roger Bishop, have been married 40 years as of this story, and for most of that time, my mother has functioned as the informal information hub of our extended family. 5 siblings on her side, 3 on my father's, a sprawling network of cousins and in-laws that, before smartphones, ran on an actual physical phone tree my mother maintained in a spiral notebook by the kitchen. Phone. When group messaging apps became widely used, roughly a decade ago, my mother created what became known, simply, as the Bishops. A group chat that started with maybe a dozen close family members and grew, over the years, to include 31 people: siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, a handful of longtime family friends who'd essentially become honorary relatives. The Bishop's chat wasn't just a place for casual conversation. It became, functionally, the actual infrastructure through which our extended family coordinated everything: holiday plans, medical updates when someone was hospitalized, birthday reminders, photos from every gathering, condolences when someone passed, the whole ordinary architecture of a large family's shared life, compressed into a single, constantly scrolling thread that most of us checked multiple times a day. I want to give you a sense of the specific texture of that chat, because I don't think its importance fully registers unless you understand how deeply woven it had become into the actual daily rhythm of our family's life. It wasn't a novelty or an occasional check-in. It was where my cousin Marisol first announced her pregnancy, a single ultrasound photo posted at 11 at night that generated over 60 responses before morning. It was where we organized, in real time, a rotating meal schedule when my grandmother, my mother's own mother, was in hospice during her final 6 weeks, a coordination effort that meant she was never once alone during that difficult stretch, because 31 people were quietly, collectively making sure of it through a single, constantly updating thread. It was where my father's youngest brother, Emmett, posted grainy, joyful photos from his belated wedding in his 60s, a celebration the whole family had rallied around after decades of him insisting he'd never marry. The chat wasn't peripheral to our family's actual life. In many meaningful ways, over the preceding decade, it had become the primary place where that life was witnessed and shared. I want you to understand what it actually meant to be removed from something like that, because I don't think people who haven't experienced it fully grasp the specific, compounding nature of the loss. It wasn't just that I stopped getting jokes and casual updates. It was that I stopped knowing things. I found out about my cousin's engagement 3 weeks late from a Facebook post after everyone else in the family had already celebrated it together in the chat. I found out my aunt had been briefly hospitalized only because I happened to call my uncle directly for an unrelated reason, and he mentioned it, assuming I already knew. Being removed from that chat didn't just cut me off from conversation. It cut me out of the actual, ongoing narrative of my own family's life in real time, while everyone else continued living inside a story I could no longer see. My sister Bridget is 2 years older than me, and I want to try to describe her fairly, because I think the way this story unfolds only makes sense if you understand that Bridget isn't a cartoonish villain. She's a specific, complicated person, shaped by her own specific pressures, who made a choice, under strain, that she has never, even now, fully been able to admit to herself was as damaging as it actually was. Bridget has always been the sibling who took on the most direct, hands-on responsibility for our parents as they've aged. She lives 12 minutes from them, where I live an hour and 40 minutes away in a different city, a distance that has, over the years, quietly shaped how much of the day-to-day caregiving fell to her versus me. I don't begrudge her that geography, and I want to be clear that I've never once thought her resentment about the imbalance was entirely unfounded. It's a real imbalance. It's just that the way it eventually expressed itself wasn't through a direct, honest conversation about needing more support. It came out sideways, through the group chat, through a story that was easier for her to tell than the truth of what she actually needed. The specific incident that started all of this happened 14 months ago, when our mother, then 68, began showing early, concerning signs of memory difficulty. Misplaced keys becoming a daily occurrence, a stove left on twice within the same month, a growing pattern of repeating the same story 3 or 4 times within a single phone call. I raised this in the group chat, directly, gently, the way I try to raise anything that might be difficult to hear. I wrote something to the effect of, "I've noticed some memory things with Mom lately that feel like more than normal aging. Would it make sense for us to talk about getting her evaluated, just to be safe?" I want you to hold on to the exact tone of that message, because it matters enormously for what happened next. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't alarmist. It was a careful, loving observation from someone who works professionally with a great many older adults and who recognized a pattern that concerned her. Bridget responded almost immediately and not gently. She wrote back, in the chat, in front of the entire extended family, that I clearly didn't spend enough time around Mom to actually understand what was normal for her age, that I was always looking for something to be alarmed about from 100 miles away, and that if I actually cared as much as I claimed to, maybe I'd move closer instead of diagnosing her over text. I responded, still gently, trying to de-escalate, clarifying that I wasn't trying to diagnose anything, just raise a concern out of love. Several relatives chimed in, some supportively, some in the vague, conflict-avoidant way people often do in group settings, trying to smooth things over without actually addressing the underlying tension. The conversation eventually moved on, the way group chat conversations do, buried under the next day's photos and small talk. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the following weeks. A slight coolness in a few responses, a couple of messages that felt, without any concrete evidence I could point to, subtly excluding in a way that was hard to name. I didn't yet understand that Bridget had, in the background, in private conversations with our mother and several other relatives, begun constructing a very different account of what had actually happened in that exchange. I didn't discover the full scope of what Bridget had been doing until much later, pieced together slowly over months, through fragments of conversations with relatives who eventually, hesitantly, told me things they'd heard, once trust between us had been at least partially rebuilt. But here is the shape of it, as best I've been able to reconstruct. In the weeks following that group chat exchange, Bridget began having private, one-on-one conversations, phone calls, separate texts, in-person visits, with several key family members, including our mother, our father, and at least 3 influential aunts and uncles who tend to shape broader family opinion. In these conversations, according to what I later learned, Bridget's account of the original group chat exchange had shifted significantly from what had actually been written and could be verified. She told our mother, specifically, that I had said Mom was losing her mind and needed to be put somewhere, language I never used, not once, in any message, anywhere. She told an aunt that I'd been cold and clinical about our mother's health, like she was a case file, not a person, framing my professional caution as a kind of emotional detachment rather than the careful concern it actually was. She told our father, in a conversation he later, much later, described to me almost apologetically, that I'd been making Mom cry with my accusations, which was, as far as I've ever been able to determine, simply untrue. Our mother had been upset by the family conflict itself, not by anything I had actually said to her directly. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters for understanding how this kind of thing happens in families and why it's so difficult to untangle once it's underway. I don't think Bridget set out, coldly and deliberately, to destroy my relationship with our parents. I think what actually happened is something more human and more insidious. She was overwhelmed, carrying most of the caregiving burden alone, resentful in ways she'd never fully articulated even to herself, and my group chat message landed on a nerve that was already raw. In that moment, rather than saying the honest thing, I need more help, and it hurts that you live so far away, she reached, I think almost instinctively, for a story that let her feel righteous instead of resentful, one where I was the problem rather than the geography and the caregiving imbalance actually being the problem. Once she told that story a few times, to a few people, and watched it land, watched people nod sympathetically and validate her anger, I think it became easier and easier to keep telling, because walking it back would have meant admitting she'd exaggerated, or worse, fabricated, and by then, admitting that felt like too large a thing to say out loud. I later learned, from my Aunt Rosalind, one of the few relatives who eventually told me directly what she'd been told, some of the specific texture of how these private conversations had unfolded. Bridget hadn't simply announced the false version once and let it stand. She'd repeated it, in slightly different forms, across several separate conversations over the following weeks, each retelling, apparently gaining a little more certainty and detail, the way a story sometimes does when a person tells it enough times that the telling itself starts to feel like remembering. By the 3rd or 4th version, according to Rosalind, Bridget was describing a scene that included details that had never existed in any form. An implication that I'd suggested our mother be moved into a facility before she embarrasses herself further, a phrase so specific, so cruel, and so entirely absent from anything I had actually written that I found myself almost admiring, in a bleak, unhappy way, how thoroughly a story can mutate once it's no longer anchored to anything that can be checked. None of that excuses what happened. I want to be clear about that too. Understanding why someone does something isn't the same as excusing the damage it does. But I think it matters for the shape of this story, because what happened next wasn't really about facts anymore. It was about a narrative that had taken on its own momentum, independent of what had actually been said in writing, available for anyone to check, if anyone had simply thought to check. I want to give you one more piece of context about Bridget specifically, because I think it deepens rather than excuses what happened, and I think understanding the deeper texture of a family matters more than reducing anyone in it to a flat villain. Bridget had, 3 years earlier, gone through a difficult divorce, one that left her raising her 2 kids largely on her own while also, increasingly, absorbing more and more of our parents' day-to-day needs. I had offered, more than once over those years, to help more directly, proposing that Mom and Dad split their time between our 2 homes for part of the year, offering to hire a part-time aide with money I'd contribute, offering, at one point, to relocate my own work schedule to spend 1 full week a month in town, specifically to give Bridget a break. Each time, Bridget had declined in ways that, at the time, seemed simply gracious. "It's really fine. I've got it handled. You have your own life. I don't want to pull you away from it. Someone needs to be the stable one for the kids, and it might as well be me." I took her at her word each time, the way you take a sibling at her word when she insists, repeatedly, that she doesn't need help. Looking back, with the fuller understanding I only gained much later, I think Bridget's repeated refusals of help weren't actually generosity. I think they were, at least in part, a way of maintaining a specific identity she'd built for herself. The responsible one, the one who showed up, the one whose worth in the family had become closely tied to being indispensable in a way that my presence, if I'd actually stepped in more, might have quietly threatened. I don't say this to diagnose her from a distance, and I want to be careful about that, since I've cautioned elsewhere in this story against speculating too confidently about someone else's inner life. I say it only because, once I understood it, months later, it helped me finally make sense of something that had otherwise felt inexplicable. Why a single, carefully worded group chat message about our mother's memory had detonated as violently as it did. It wasn't really about the message. It was about 6 years of quietly accumulated resentment finally finding a place to land. I found out I'd been removed from the group chat on a Tuesday afternoon in March, roughly 6 weeks after the original exchange, when I noticed I hadn't received any notifications in 2 days. Unusual, given the chat's normal, near-constant activity. I opened the app to find the thread simply gone from my message list. No explanation, no notification of removal, just a quiet, technical absence where a constant presence used to be. I called my mother that evening, careful to keep my tone gentle and non-accusatory, genuinely more confused than upset at that point. I asked if something had happened with the chat, if maybe there'd been a technical glitch. My mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the careful, rehearsed voice I mentioned at the start of this story, "I think it's better this way for now, honey." After everything you said, I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly she meant by everything I said. She hesitated, and then repeated back to me, almost verbatim, the version Bridget had apparently told her, that I'd said cruel, clinical things about her memory, that I'd made her cry, that I'd suggested she needed to be put somewhere. I sat on my kitchen floor, phone against my ear, genuinely stunned, because none of it was true. And yet my own mother was repeating it back to me with the specific, settled certainty of someone who'd heard it enough times to stop questioning it. I told her, as clearly as I could, that none of that had happened, that I still had the actual messages, that she was welcome to look at them herself. My mother's response, which I've thought about many times since, was, "Bridget wouldn't make something like that up, Karine. She's the one who's actually there for me every day. I think maybe you remember it differently than what you actually said. I want you to sit with that sentence, because I think it captures something painfully specific about how these situations metastasize." It wasn't that my mother necessarily thought I was lying, exactly. It was that she'd already, unconsciously, decided that Bridget's daily, hands-on presence gave her account more inherent credibility than mine, regardless of what the actual written record might show. A record she never asked to see, because asking to see it would have meant entertaining the possibility that her more present, more geographically available daughter had lied to her. I want to walk you through what those 6 months were actually like, because I think it's important not to compress real, sustained pain into a quick summary the way people sometimes do when they're eager to get to the satisfying part of a story. This wasn't a clean, single wound. It was a slow, grinding, ongoing loss that touched almost every part of my relationship with my family. I missed my cousin's engagement announcement, learning about it weeks late from social media. I missed being included in the planning for my aunt's 60th birthday celebration, learning about the party itself only because a family friend, not realizing I'd been excluded, casually mentioned it to me at an unrelated event, assuming I'd already RSVP'd. I missed knowing, in real time, when my father had a minor health scare. A brief chest pain episode that turned out to be nothing serious, but that the entire extended family discussed and processed together, in the chat, over the course of an anxious evening, while I found out about it 2 days later, secondhand, once the crisis had already passed and everyone had already collectively worked through their fear together without me. There are 3 specific moments from those 6 months that I still think about more than any others, because they crystallize something the smaller omissions hadn't quite managed to. The first happened in May, roughly 2 months into my exclusion, when my niece, Bridget's oldest daughter, 15 at the time, made the varsity soccer team, something she'd been working toward for 2 full years, through injuries and setbacks and a level of dedication that genuinely impressed everyone who watched her. The entire extended family celebrated it together in the chat, dozens of congratulatory messages, plans forming spontaneously for a group outing to her first game. I found out about the team placement 3 weeks later. At a family friend's barbecue I happened to attend when someone mentioned it in passing. Assuming I already knew, the way you assume a favorite aunt already knows something everyone else has been celebrating together for weeks. I remember standing there, holding a paper plate, working very hard to keep my face steady, congratulating a niece I loved for something I should have known about the moment it happened, doing the math in my head on exactly how many other things I'd missed without ever realizing they'd happened at all. The second happened in July, when my uncle Desmond, my father's younger brother, had a minor stroke. Not severe, thankfully, and he recovered well, but serious enough that the family spent an anxious, frightened 48 hours coordinating hospital visits and updates entirely within the chat. I didn't learn about it until Desmond himself, once he was home and recovering, called me directly to thank me for a get well card he assumed I'd sent along with everyone else in the family. A card I had, of course, never sent, because I hadn't known anything had happened. I had to explain, awkwardly, to a recovering stroke patient that I hadn't been aware of his hospitalization at all, and I watched, even over the phone, the specific confusion in his voice as he tried to understand how that could possibly be true. The third, and the one that hurt the most, happened in September, when my mother had a routine but somewhat anxious-making mammogram that came back requiring a follow-up biopsy. The entire family rallied around her through the chat during the 2-week wait for results. Supportive messages, offers to accompany her to appointments, the kind of collective, loving anxiety a family shares when someone they love is waiting on frightening news. I found out about the entire situation only after the biopsy came back benign, when my mother mentioned it herself, almost casually, during an unrelated phone call, clearly assuming I'd already been through the whole worried, hopeful process alongside everyone else. I hadn't had the chance to worry alongside my family. I hadn't had the chance to offer comfort, or receive it, or simply be present for 2 weeks of genuine fear about my own mother's health. That absence, more than any of the others, made something in me go very quiet and very resolved, in a way I didn't fully understand yet myself. Each of these moments, individually, might have seemed small enough to absorb. Cumulatively, over 6 months, they built into something that felt less like a series of unfortunate omissions and more like a systematic, thorough erasure. As though I'd become a peripheral character in the story of my own family, watching from outside a window I used to be able to walk directly through. I tried, several times during those months, to address it directly. I called Bridget once, early on, and asked her, as calmly as I could manage, why she'd told our parents things I'd never said. She became defensive almost immediately, insisting that she remembered the conversation, essentially the way she described it, that I was twisting things by focusing on the exact wording instead of the spirit of what was clearly implied. I asked her to simply look at the actual messages with me, side by side, and she refused, saying she didn't need to relitigate the whole thing and that I should maybe think about why everyone else in the family seems to remember it the way I do, instead of assuming everyone else is wrong. I tried once more with my mother directly, a few months later, offering to send her screenshots of the actual conversation. She declined, gently but firmly, saying she didn't want to get in the middle of it, and that she thought everyone just needed some space to cool down. I understood, even in that moment, that what she was actually describing wasn't neutrality. It was a choice to preserve the version of events that required the least conflict for her personally, even if that version happened to be false. I want to explain something about my own professional habits here, because I think it's the actual hinge this entire story turns on. And I don't think it's an accident that a digital literacy instructor happened to be the one this specific situation happened to. Part of my job, for over a decade, has involved teaching people. Mostly people over 60. Mostly people navigating technology that changes faster than they feel equipped to keep up with. One consistent, foundational lesson. If a piece of digital information matters to you, you don't trust the platform to preserve it for you indefinitely. You save it yourself, in a format and a location you control. I've taught hundreds of people this lesson in the context of protecting themselves from scams, from platform outages, from accidentally deleted photos of grandchildren they can never get back. I have said some version of the sentence, if it matters, save it separately, more times than I could possibly count. I had, as a simple matter of habit rather than any specific foresight, been taking periodic screenshots of the Bishop's family group chat for years. Not obsessively, not with any suspicion, just the same low-grade, professional instinct that makes me back up anything meaningful in my own digital life. I had, sitting in a cloud backup folder, a reasonably complete visual record of the chat going back nearly 4 years, including, critically, every message from the exact exchange that had started all of this. I didn't immediately think to use these screenshots as evidence. For the first several weeks after my removal, I was simply too hurt and too confused to think strategically about anything. It was only after that second failed conversation with my mother, the one where she declined even to look at the actual messages, that something shifted in me. I realized, with a kind of quiet, settling clarity, that this wasn't a situation that was going to resolve itself through gentle, repeated appeals to reason. Bridget's version of events had already calcified into accepted family fact, reinforced by 6 months of repetition and my own enforced absence from the conversation. If I wanted the truth to actually matter, I was going to need to present it in a form nobody could quietly wave away. I spent an evening, roughly 4 months into my exclusion, organizing the screenshots methodically. The same way I organize any information professionally, chronologically, clearly labeled, cross-referenced against timestamps that couldn't be disputed. I didn't do anything with them yet. I simply made sure they existed, complete and ready, in case an opportunity ever arose where the truth might actually be heard rather than dismissed. I want to tell you about one more conversation from this period, because I think it shaped my thinking more than almost anything else, and because I don't want this story to sound like I arrived at my eventual decision entirely alone, through some purely internal process of resolve. My closest friend from college, Priya, works as a family mediator, professionally trained in exactly the kind of conflict I was navigating personally, and I called her roughly 5 months into all of this, mostly just to vent, not really expecting concrete advice. She listened for a long time without interrupting, the way good mediators are trained to, and then she asked me a question that reframed the entire situation for me. "What are you actually trying to accomplish?" she asked. "If you do decide to show them the messages? Are you trying to win an argument, or are you trying to repair something?" I sat with that question for a long moment because I realized I hadn't actually separated those two goals in my own mind. Some part of me, I admitted to her, honestly, did want to win. Wanted Bridget to feel, publicly, some fraction of the humiliation and confusion I'd been carrying privately for months. But a larger part of me, once I actually examined it, wanted something different and harder. I wanted my family back, intact, built on something true, not a hollow victory that left everyone more entrenched and divided than before. Then the way you show them matters as much as what you show them, Priya said. If you do this in a way that's designed to humiliate Bridget in front of everyone, you might win the specific argument and lose the actual thing you're trying to get back. I didn't fully know, in that conversation, whether or how I'd eventually use what I had. But her question stayed with me for months, quietly shaping the decision I eventually made about exactly how and where and in what spirit to finally show my family the truth. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was planned for early autumn, a large celebration my mother had been organizing for the better part of a year. A rented event hall, a full guest list of 31 family members and close friends, a genuine, significant milestone that meant a great deal to both of my parents. I received an invitation. I want to note that specifically because it tells you something important about the strange, contradictory logic of my exclusion. I had been quietly erased from the daily infrastructure of family life, but not, apparently, from the guest list for a major milestone celebration, a contradiction that I think reveals how unexamined and reflexive the whole situation had actually become. Nobody had made a deliberate, considered decision that I should be fully cut out of the family. It had simply happened, incrementally, through a series of smaller choices nobody had stopped to fully reckon with. I debated, for several days, whether to attend at all. Part of me wanted to simply decline, to protect myself from another evening of feeling like a ghost at my own family's table. But a larger part of me, I think, understood that this event, 31 relatives gathered in one room, including several of the same people Bridget had spoken to privately over the preceding months, represented the first real opportunity I'd had to address this directly, in a setting where the truth could actually be seen rather than simply asserted. I decided to attend, and I decided, in the days leading up to it, to bring my laptop. The anniversary party was held at a rented hall on the edge of town, decorated with white string lights and a large banner reading 40 Y-years, Toast Her, the kind of warm, genuinely celebratory event that made the whole situation feel even more surreal to sit inside. A room full of people who loved my parents, gathered to celebrate something real and good while I carried, quietly, in my bag, the specific, uncomfortable truth that I'd need to present before the night was over. I arrived early, before most of the guests, and spoke briefly with the venue's staff about the audiovisual setup they had available for the evening's planned toasts and a slideshow of old family photos my mother had put together. There was a projector, connected to a laptop input, set up near the head table specifically for that slideshow. I noted it, quietly, without yet knowing whether I'd actually need it. I want to describe the early part of that evening honestly, because I think it matters for understanding just how ordinary and warm it initially felt, which made everything that followed feel even more disorienting once it happened. My mother, in a soft lavender dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, moved through the room greeting relatives with the particular, radiant happiness of a woman who'd spent a year planning something and was finally watching it unfold exactly as she'd hoped. My father, uncharacteristically emotional for a man who rarely showed much outward sentiment, teared up more than once, simply looking around the room at everyone who'd come. I found myself, more than once during those first 2 hours, genuinely swept up in the occasion, momentarily forgetting the weight I'd carried in with me, laughing with cousins I hadn't seen in over a year, catching up with an aunt about her recent retirement, feeling, for stretches at a time, something close to the easy, uncomplicated belonging I'd felt in this family before any of this had happened. I sat, for most of dinner, at a table with several cousins closer to my own age, and at one point, my cousin Marisol, the same cousin whose pregnancy announcement had once lit up the group chat for an entire evening, now a toddler asleep in a stroller beside her, leaned over and asked, quietly, whether I was doing all right, whether the whole situation with Bridget had finally settled down. I told her, honestly, that that I'd simply stopped bringing it up because it never seemed to go anywhere productive. She squeezed my hand under the table and said, "For what it's worth, I never believed the version Bridget was telling people. It never sounded like you." I didn't know, in that moment, how much I needed to hear that from someone. But I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. A small, private validation before the larger, more public one that was still to come. The evening unfolded warmly for its first 2 hours. Dinner, toasts from my father's siblings, the photo slideshow my mother had prepared, a genuinely moving retrospective of 40 years of marriage that brought most of the room, myself included, to tears more than once. I want to be honest that some part of me, watching that slideshow, questioned whether I actually wanted to disrupt an evening this genuinely joyful with a confrontation nobody else in the room was expecting or asking for. The moment that changed my mind happened during the informal toasts near the end of the evening, when Bridget stood up, glass in hand, and began speaking not just about our parents' marriage, but unprompted about family more broadly, about the importance of actually showing up for the people you love, about how some people talk a good game about caring, but real love is about presence, not just words. She didn't say my name directly. She didn't have to. Several relatives' eyes moved toward me, briefly, knowingly, in exactly the way people's eyes move when a pointed comment has landed precisely where it was aimed. I felt the old, familiar urge to simply absorb it quietly, the way I had absorbed 6 months of smaller erasures. But something about hearing it delivered publicly, dressed up as a toast to our parents' marriage, wrapped in language that painted me, implicitly, as someone who talked about care without actually providing it. After everything I had actually done, after 14 months of being the one who'd first noticed and raised concern about our mother's health, after 6 months of being quietly written out, of my own family's story based on a version of events that had never actually happened, something in me settled, finally, into a decision. I did the thing I've done professionally, for years, when someone needs to understand something clearly and completely, rather than in fragments they can dismiss or reinterpret. I asked the venue coordinator, quietly, if I could add a brief addition to the slideshow setup. I connected my laptop. I stood, once Bridget had finished her toast and the room had settled back into its warm, low murmur of conversation, and I asked, gently but clearly, if I could say a few words too. My mother, seated near the head table, looked briefly uncertain, but nodded. The way you nod when you're not sure what's coming, but don't want to make a scene by declining. I want to start, I said, by saying I love you both. And this has been a genuinely beautiful night, and I don't want to take anything away from that. I paused, feeling the room's attention settle fully onto me for the first time all evening. But I need to say something else too, because I've been carrying it quietly for 6 months, and I don't think it's fair to any of us, including Bridget, to keep carrying it in silence. I explained, as calmly and plainly as I could, what had happened 14 months earlier. The group chat message about our mother's memory, expressed out of genuine concern, nothing more. I explained that I'd been removed from the family chat 6 months ago, after a version of that conversation had circulated privately that bore very little resemblance to what I'd actually written. I explained that I'd tried, more than once, to simply show the actual messages to the people who mattered most, and had been declined each time. So tonight, I said, I'd like to actually show everyone. Not to embarrass anyone, not to ruin this celebration, but because I think, after 6 months, everyone in this room deserves to see what was actually said, instead of continuing to trust a version of events that isn't true. I connected the screenshots to the projector, and I displayed, in order, chronologically, the actual messages from that original exchange. My careful, gentle observation about our mother's memory, Bridget's sharp public response accusing me of diagnosing her over text and not caring enough to move closer, my own de-escalating replies, the entire actual, verifiable record, exactly as it had been written, timestamps intact, nothing edited or reframed. The room was very quiet while people read. I watched several relatives' expressions shift in real time. The specific, uncomfortable recalibration of people realizing they'd repeated and believed a version of events that simply wasn't accurate. I watched my mother's hand go to her mouth. I watched my father, beside her, read the actual words on the screen with an expression I can only describe as quietly devastated, the particular grief of a parent realizing he spent 6 months treating one daughter unfairly based on a story the other daughter had constructed. My Aunt Rosalind, my mother's older sister, was the first to speak, her voice carrying easily across the now silent room. "Bridget, honey," she said, slowly, "this isn't what you told me." "You told me, Karine," said Diane needed to be institutionalized. "This just says she thought maybe Mom should see a doctor." Beside her, my Uncle Desmond. The same uncle who'd thanked me for a card I never sent. set down his fork entirely, and looked, for a long moment, directly at Bridget, saying nothing, which somehow felt heavier than if he'd spoken. Bridget, across the room, had gone very pale. That's not. That's not the whole context, she started, but her voice had none of the certainty it usually carried. There were other conversations, things that happened after this, things that aren't in whatever you're showing everyone. Then show them, I said, gently, not cruelly, and I meant it. If there's more context, more messages, anything at all that changes what's on this screen, I would genuinely welcome you pulling it up right now, in front of everyone, the same way I have. I'm not asking anyone to take my word over yours. I'm asking everyone to look at the actual record, whatever it turns out to say. Bridget didn't pull anything up. She stood there for a long moment, in front of 31 relatives, in front of our parents on the most significant anniversary of their marriage, and she didn't have anything else to show, because there wasn't anything else. The silence that followed was, I think, the loudest moment of the entire evening. My father was the one who finally spoke, his voice unsteady in a way I don't think I'd ever heard from him before, not even at his own mother's funeral. "Bridget," he said, "did you tell your mother and me that Karina said these things? The exact things I just watched her never actually say?" Bridget's eyes filled, and for a moment I genuinely didn't know whether what was coming would be an admission or another deflection. "I was so tired," she said, finally, quietly, the fight visibly draining out of her all at once. "I've been doing this alone for years, and it felt like she got to swoop in from 100 miles away and act concerned without actually carrying any of the weight. And I wanted someone else to feel some part of what I've been carrying. I didn't plan it out. It just sort of became the story. And once people started agreeing with me, it got harder to say it wasn't exactly right. I want to be honest that hearing that, in that specific moment, in front of everyone, did something complicated to me. It didn't erase the 6 months of hurt, but it did, immediately, make the whole situation feel less like a story about a villain and a victim, and more like what it actually was. Two sisters, both genuinely struggling in different, unspoken ways, whose pain had collided badly, in public, in a form that had cost me my place in my own family for half a year. "I need you to say the sentence directly, though," I said, still gently, because I understood, even in that moment, that the room needed to hear an actual correction, not just an explanation. For Mom and Dad, and for everyone here who heard the other version. Did I say Mom needed to be put somewhere? Did I make her cry with an accusation? Bridget shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper now. "No, you didn't. I'm sorry, Karine. I'm so sorry." I made it sound worse than it was, and I let it stay that way for way too long because it was easier than admitting I'd exaggerated something that hurt you this badly. I want to be honest about the immediate aftermath, because it wasn't a clean, satisfying resolution wrapped up neatly before the cake was cut. Bridget left the party early, upset, and we didn't speak directly for almost 3 weeks afterward. My parents were shaken for the rest of that evening, understandably, caught between grief over what had happened and the genuine joy of their own anniversary celebration, two emotions sitting uncomfortably close together for the remainder of the night. But something real did shift in the weeks that followed. My mother called me 2 days later, her voice unsteady, and apologized. Genuinely, specifically, not the vague, smoothing over apology I think she might have offered months earlier, but a real reckoning with what she'd allowed to happen. "I should have asked to see the messages the very first time you offered," she said. "I think it was just easier not to look, because looking would have meant admitting I'd let something unfair happen to you for months, and I didn't want that to be true." I was re-added to the family group chat within the week, and my mother, on her own initiative, sent a message to the full group. 31 people, clarifying, plainly, that the original account of what I'd said had been inaccurate, and that she wanted the record corrected for everyone who'd heard the earlier version. Bridget and I had a difficult, honest conversation about 6 weeks after the party, the first real one we'd had in over a year. She didn't fully apologize in that first conversation. I want to be honest about that, because I think pretending this resolved into perfect reconciliation would be dishonest to how these things actually unfold. But she did, for the first time, acknowledge that she'd exaggerated what I'd said, and, More importantly, she finally said the thing I think had been underneath all of it from the very beginning, that she felt overwhelmed and alone in caring for our aging parents, and that some part of her had wanted me to feel some version of the isolation she'd been quietly carrying for years. That conversation, uncomfortable as it was, actually did more to repair our relationship than the confrontation at the party had, because it finally addressed the real, underlying wound instead of just correcting the surface level facts. We've since worked out an actual, concrete plan for sharing our parents' care more fairly. Regular video calls where I'm directly involved in medical appointments, even from a distance, a rotating schedule for visits, an honest, ongoing conversation about what Bridget actually needs from me, rather than a resentment she'd previously expressed sideways through a story that wasn't true. I wanted to tell you about two more moments from the months since, because I think they show something the party confrontation alone couldn't fully capture: the slow, uneven, genuinely difficult work of actually rebuilding trust, rather than simply correcting a record. The first happened at Thanksgiving, roughly 2 months after the anniversary party, the first major family gathering since everything had come out into the open. I arrived uncertain of what to expect, half braced for lingering awkwardness, half hoping enough time had passed for things to feel more settled. What I found, instead, was something more complicated and more real than either of those expectations. Several relatives, my Aunt Rosalind especially, went out of their way to include me in every conversation, almost overcorrecting, in a way that felt touching, even as it also, quietly, underlined how thoroughly I'd been excluded before. Bridget and I spoke carefully throughout the day, still finding our footing, still occasionally hitting a beat of old, unspoken tension, but genuinely trying, in a way that felt different from the performative warmth of the months right after her original message in the chat. At one point, in the kitchen, just the two of us, she said, quietly, almost to herself, "I keep thinking about how long I let it go on. 6 months, Kareen. I could have corrected it after the first month. And I didn't. Because some part of me still wanted it to be true, even after I knew it wasn't. I didn't have a perfect response to that. I just told her I was glad she was saying it now, and that I thought we were actually going to be okay, eventually, even if eventually wasn't going to arrive all at once. The second moment happened 4 months after the party, when our mother had a follow-up appointment with a neurologist. The appointment I'd originally, gently, suggested we consider all those months earlier, before any of this had happened. This time, I was included from the very beginning, looped into every conversation about scheduling, invited to join by video call for the actual appointment itself. The neurologist's assessment was reassuring. Normal age-related changes, nothing indicating a more serious concern, exactly the kind of outcome I'd hoped for when I'd first raised it, gently, all those months ago, in a message that had somehow detonated an entire family's equilibrium. Sitting on that video call, watching my mother nod along with the doctor's explanation, Bridget beside her in the room, both of them glancing occasionally toward the small square of screen where I was included, present, part of the conversation the way I should have been from the start, I felt something in my chest finally loosen that had been tight for the better part of a year. I don't want to overstate how completely resolved everything has become, because I think that would be its own kind of dishonesty. Bridget and I still have moments of old tension, particularly around the ongoing, genuinely difficult logistics of caring for aging parents from different distances. But we talk about it now, directly, instead of letting it curdle sideways into a story neither of us can fully control once it starts moving through a family's collective memory. I want to tell you about one more conversation, this one with my father specifically, because I think it's the one that actually healed something in me that even Bridget's apology hadn't fully reached. My father called me, alone, about 3 weeks after the anniversary party, on a weekday evening when I wasn't expecting to hear from him. He's never been the sibling who initiates calls. That had always, in our family, been my mother's role. He was quiet for a moment after I answered, and then he said, "I keep thinking about all the family events over the last 6 months where I just assumed you didn't want to be there. Your cousin's engagement party. The barbecue at Desmond's. I told people you were probably just busy, Kareen. I never once thought to ask you directly, or to wonder whether something else was actually going on." His voice caught, slightly, in a way I'd genuinely never heard from him in 36 years. "I'm your father. I should have asked. I'm sorry I didn't." I told him, honestly, that I understood how easy it was, in a large family, for one person's version of events to become the default assumption everyone else quietly builds on top of, especially when correcting it would require an uncomfortable conversation nobody particularly wants to have. But I also told him that hearing him say it directly, unprompted, meant more to me than almost anything else that had happened since the party itself. We talked for almost an hour that evening, longer than any phone call I could remember having with him in years, about things that had nothing to do with any of this. His garden, a book he was reading, a story from his own childhood I'd never heard before. I think, in its own quiet way, that ordinary, meandering conversation did more to rebuild something between us than any formal apology could have managed on its own. The following Christmas, just over a year after the anniversary party, our extended family gathered again, all 31 of us, at my parents' house this time instead of a rented hall. I want to close with a small, specific image from that evening, because I think it captures, better than any summary could, exactly what had actually been repaired. Late in the night, once most of the younger cousins had fallen asleep on various couches and the adults had settled into the slower, quieter rhythm that comes at the end of a long family gathering, my mother pulled out her phone, opened the bishop's chat, and began scrolling back through photos from the evening, already being posted and shared in real time by relatives throughout the house. She held the phone out to me, the way she used to before any of this happened, showing me a photo my niece had just posted of the whole family gathered around the tree. "Look how many of us there are," she said, smiling, and then, quieter, just to me, "I'm glad you're back in this. I mean, really back in it, not just the invitation list." I don't think I understood, until I almost lost it, how much this whole thing. She gestured, slightly, at the phone, at the chat, at the whole sprawling architecture of 31 people staying connected across an ordinary Tuesday and an anxious hospital night and a milestone anniversary alike. Actually depends on everyone in it, trusting that what gets said in here is true. I'm sorry it took what it took for me to understand that. I didn't have a perfect response for that either. I just leaned my head against her shoulder, the way I used to as a child, and watched the photos keep arriving, one after another, an entire family's ordinary, complicated, genuinely loving life, documented in real time, exactly the way it was actually happening, with nobody missing from the frame. I want to tell you about one more thing before I close this out, because it happened almost a year after the anniversary party, and I think it circles back to where this whole story actually began. Not in my own family, but in the work I do every day, teaching people how to protect the things that matter to them. I was leading a class at the library, part of a regular series I teach for older adults on digital safety and organization, and one of my regular students, a warm, sharp woman in her 70s named Eleanor, stayed after the session to talk. She told me, a little hesitantly, that her daughter had recently accused her, in front of the rest of the family, of favoring one grandchild over another. Something Eleanor insisted, quietly and with real hurt in her voice, she had never actually said or done, but that had somehow become an accepted fact within her family regardless. "Nobody will even look at the actual conversation," she told me. "They've just decided what happened, and now I'm the villain in my own story." I sat with her for almost half an hour after class, well past when I was supposed to leave, and I found myself, without fully planning to, telling her a version of my own story. Not in detail, not with names, but enough for her to understand that I genuinely knew what she was describing from the inside. I told her the same thing I'd eventually learned myself, the hard way, that if something mattered, and if the truth of it was ever going to be at risk of being rewritten by someone else's more convenient version, she needed to hold onto the actual record, whatever form that took for her situation, and she needed to trust that the truth, preserved carefully enough, eventually tends to find its way back into the light, even if it takes longer than feels fair in the moment. She thanked me, and I watched her leave that evening a little steadier than she'd arrived, and I sat alone in the empty classroom afterward, turning over the strange, quiet symmetry of it. That the exact professional habit I'd spent over a decade teaching other people, almost as a kind of practical footnote to broader digital literacy, had turned out to be the single thing that saved my own place, in my own family, and was now, in its own small way, helping someone else protect theirs. I think about Eleanor sometimes, and I think about all the other students I've taught this same lesson to over the years, most of whom, I'd guess, Never expected to need it in quite the way I eventually did. I don't think any of us fully anticipate the moment our own careful habits will end up being the thing that saves something we love. You just build the habit anyway, quietly, consistently, because it feels like good practice. And then, occasionally, without warning, it turns out to have been the most important thing you ever did. I think about this whole experience often, and I want to close with what I actually believe it taught me, because I don't think the lesson is simply always keep receipts, even though that's certainly part of it. What I actually learned is something more specific about how families sustain unfairness. Not usually through a single, dramatic act of cruelty, but through a slow accumulation of people choosing the easier story over the harder truth, again and again, because the easier story requires less conflict, less discomfort, less willingness to sit with the possibility that someone they trust might have gotten something significantly wrong. My mother didn't exclude me because she believed, deep down, that I was a cruel or careless daughter. She excluded me because believing Bridget's version required less immediate pain than confronting the alternative. That her more present, more geographically convenient daughter had lied to her, repeatedly, over months. I don't think keeping screenshots is really the deepest lesson here, even though it's the mechanism that ultimately mattered. I think the deeper lesson is about the specific responsibility we all carry, in our families and beyond, to actually look at evidence when it's offered to us, rather than defaulting to whichever version of events costs us the least emotionally in the moment. Truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's actively inconvenient, especially when the person telling the truth is the one who's easiest to temporarily set aside. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever been quietly written out of your own family's story while you weren't in the room to correct it, you are allowed to keep the record straight, even when doing so feels uncomfortable, even when everyone around you seems to have already settled into a version of events that isn't true. You don't owe anyone your silent, permanent absorption of a story that was never actually yours to carry. Save what matters. Keep the truth intact, even when nobody's asking to see it yet. Sometimes, eventually, someone finally will. Comment the word screenshot one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. They deleted me from the family group chat. They just never thought about the fact that I'd already saved every single word.